So our next speaker is Rose Bryant-Smith. She's the co-founder and director of WorkLogic. Rose has had a long-term passion about building ethical and productive workplaces, and she leads WorkLogic's consulting projects on organisational values, risk management, business ethics and corporate governance. She also creates digital products to build better teams and is an acclaimed speaker and author. So she's going to be both presenting in this session on leading on inappropriate behaviour in the workplace and complaints management, but then also leading a more interactive session post-lunch where you're all going to be put to work to start thinking about how you might design some solutions based on what you've heard so far today. So please join me in welcoming Rose.
Hello everyone. Just so that you know that I deserve to be standing here, I'm also on the board of the Queen Elizabeth Centre, which some of you know is in Noble Park. It's an early parenting centre, and also Australian Home Care Services that's owned by the MS Society. And thanks to the YWCA for appointing me to my first board at age 30, makes it, those sorts of initiatives from some time ago make it a little bit easier for the Victorian government quotas to be met. So I am a licensed private investigator of workplace misconduct and also a workplace relations lawyer. So I've seen the worst of the worst. And in fact, yesterday I spent 3.5 hours interviewing a professor at a university who's accused of raping a student. Now, sadly, these sorts of things are not that uncommon. And I'd like to start just by, firstly, I should acknowledge, as we all have today appropriately, that we are meeting and joining here together on the lands of the Kulin Nation. And I'd also like to thank Paul Grimes, the Victorian Public Sector Commissioner, for his excellent words today on respect and also the great value that the People Matters survey gives to each of us. I work for a lot of different government agencies and departments, and it's amazing how often they say to me, well, we've just been looking at People Matters. We knew we had an issue in this unit, but now we can't pretend it's not there. So thank you for the accountability and the very visible the statistics you give us, which make some of our challenges very visible. I'd also like to thank Kim Peake, Secretary of the Department, for her work leading this space over the last few years in terms of naming we do have issues with bullying, harassment and sexual harassment in healthcare, and we need to do something about that. Working with the department, seeing the work they're doing around action plans, workplace facilitators that Kim mentioned, there really is a lot of availability of resources and support for us as directors of health services to really move the needle on these things. So thank you to both of them. So what I'm going to talk about today is, firstly, just a little reminder, if you like, of what some of the risks are in terms of workplace behaviour and culture, focusing on bullying, sexual harassment, and also corruption and inappropriate behaviour. And then talk about what all these laws, regulations and statistics that we've seen some this morning, what do they mean for us as directors? Because I think one of the challenges that we face on boards of health services that have sometimes quite complex workforces with a number of different specialists, everything from cleaners, security guards, professors, surgeons, you name it, they can be quite complex from a workplace relations perspective and have a number of different risks. And so what do we do with the fact that we know bullying, sexual harassment and discrimination are all too common, and we know that they damage the performance of our institutions and also increase risks? What does that mean for us as governors of those organisations? So that's what I'm going to focus on this morning. How can bad behaviour and occupational health and safety risks become apparent at board level? So what are the signs we should be looking for, both as lead indicators and lag indicators of these risks? And what should we be asking for? What sorts of discussions should we be having at board level? And what should we be focusing on in terms of the reports that we're asking of our executives? So let's start with bullying. So bullying, as defined by WorkSafe, is persistent and repeated negative behaviour that's directed at an employee that creates a risk to their health and safety. I'll just mention, for those of you who are furiously scribbling notes, we will be circulating the slides at the end of this session, so you don't need to write these down. Some of you might be thinking, oh, I thought that the definition was a bit different in the policy that applies at our workplace. That may well be because a previous definition used in Victoria was repeated unreasonable behaviour that creates a risk to the health and safety of a worker or group of workers. They effectively ban the same behaviour. So the definition that you have in your policy doesn't necessarily be, needn't necessarily be exactly this one. Now, some types of bullying are very obvious. So swearing, aggression. Those of you who followed the Royal College of Surgeons and the work that they were doing around bullying in the workplace saw some terrible stories about throwing scalpels and other physical bullying. But in addition, bullying encompasses behaviours that undermine and damage people's health or safety, like humiliation, pranks and initiation rituals. I think hazing is less common in hospitals and increasingly less common, thankfully, in most industries. But we still see in the work that we do physical bullying like standover tactics and significant aggression. Sometimes people focus very much on the more work-based types of bullying around, for example, withholding resources or information that are needed for someone to do their job. Sometimes people worry about that might be sort of too broad for bullying, but effectively it will only really be bullying if it is meeting that definition and really undermining someone's ability to do their job. Sadly, aggression and bullying and occupational violence are all too common. So we've seen statistics, for example, from the WHO that say up to 38% of health employees suffer physical violence at work during their careers. The Australian College of Surgeons report in 2015 found that almost half of surgeons and trainees had experienced bullying in the last 12 months. And we saw the ad campaign that WorkSafe did around, mid-2017 around violence towards health workers, and that's, violence and aggression is not okay, which I thought was really good and really important to highlight. Yes, we're aware that patients and their families are often in trauma, are very agitated, very fearful, but they shouldn't take that out on staff. And knowing that that is a possibility, and in fact, as we've seen from the statistics from Commissioner Grimes this morning, quite common, we need to be mindful that that is a risk we must manage at the governance level. As I've mentioned there, poor performance management is a risk factor. I heard a question this morning about that. We do see quite often bullying alleged in poor performance processes, just because there are some helpful decisions that have come out from the Fair Work Commission around what reasonable management action is. So just because a worker hears something they don't like, gets negative feedback or feels distressed, that doesn't necessarily mean they've been bullied. So reasonable management action is an exception to bullying, and it holds that if, for example, in a poor performance context, if the negative feedback that's being given to the employee is reasonable in terms of the basis for that feedback, if it's delivered in a reasonable way, so it's not shouting, belittling, standing over, pointing, etc., it's explaining calmly, this is the standard you need to meet, this is how you're not meeting the standard, etc. And if the person delivering the feedback is, as far as they believe, reasonably following the process that the organisation has for performance management, then it will not be bullying. I mean, when I started work at WorkLogic about 10 years ago, bullying really wasn't even properly recognised in the occupational health and safety space as a risk to psychological health. Since then, we've had Brodie's Law that some of you might be aware of. It's now in the Crimes Act as well as in the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And increasingly, legal cases are testing out sort of what is bullying and what it isn't. So those are very helpful, I think, for us as employers and employees, for that matter. If anyone has any questions about these particular areas, you are welcome to pop your hand up as we're going, and there will be some roving microphones. Sexual harassment, as we heard this morning from Commissioner Grimes, is still very high, and particularly high amongst younger female nurses. I think it was 1 in 5 reported that they'd experienced sexual harassment in the last 12 months. Obviously, that is absolutely unacceptable. I think we'd like to think that the old days when, you know, a pat on the bum was thought to be okay and people could be pressured to go out on dates, you know, we'd like to think that that time has passed, but unfortunately it hasn't really. I think some of the risk factors that can make sexual harassment more common include significant imbalances of power. Work relationships can also be quite messy. Apparently, online dating has only just overtaken meeting someone at work as the most common way that people are meeting these days. There you go. But it's fine to meet someone at work and develop a romantic relationship, but only if it's consensual. And one of the things that I hear all too often in sexual harassment complaints is, I thought she was up for it, or he for that matter. I thought it was okay, I only asked a few times. Isn't that part of romantic pursuit? No, it's not at work. You can ask them once. If they say no, then it's unwanted conduct of a sexual or romantic nature. So don't ask again. It shouldn't be that complicated. Another area of risk that we see playing out in our investigation of sexual harassment complaints is social media. And the use of smartphones, where either photos that were taken during the relationship, which were intended to be private, are shared in the workplace, you know, by texting to colleagues, for example, or shared on social media. And in fact, even outside of a working relationship, a romantic relationship, a lot of employees don't seem to understand that if you have friends on Facebook and you have posted material of a sexual nature, or for that matter, you know, an inflammatory racist nature, or in other way breach of the organisation's values, particularly if you have colleagues as friends, you know, those Facebook posts are up and public, at least to your friends, 24/7. So it's not just after hours, the things that you've posted and sent to your Facebook friends, they're up there all the time. Obviously, particularly concerning are inappropriate touching, sexual assault as well. We also see and stalking, which is often bullying and sexual harassment put together. So the Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission is, as it should be, a very powerful organisation that can operate quite secretly. And can tap you on the shoulder and say, we need to speak to you, and you can't tell anybody else that we've asked you to speak to you. Ooh. Friends of mine have had that tap on the shoulder and had to go down and be interviewed about concerns that have arisen about things that are going on in their organisation. IBAC, as it's known, can take complaints from the public very, very easily about any public sector officer or body doing all sorts of things, such as taking bribes, offering bribes, dishonestly using their influence. So as you can see, it's broader than theft and fraud. Also misusing information or material that they've acquired at work, or conspiring or attempting to do any of these things. And in addition, IBAC can also take complaints about misconduct in public office. Now that's defined very broadly. It's about conduct of employees which is unlawful or fails to meet the ethical or professional standards in the performance of duties or the exercise of powers entrusted to them. So this includes misuse of power to harm or damage someone, or failure to disclose a conflict of interest. Now, some of the common examples we see of IBAC-related misconduct are often around procurement, particularly in smaller organisations where only one or two people are across the procurement decision, and there's not much transparency around that. I think this is particularly hard in smaller communities where you know everyone, right? The person making the decision about what company should be awarded that contract may well know more than half of the people who are putting in proposals in the tender process, you know, through the footy club or the church or the RSL or whatever it is, and it can make it very tricky to make a decision that is very clearly not influenced by personal relationships. So it doesn't mean they can't be done, it just means they need to be handled very carefully. And I think also over a period of years, sometimes people forget, well, I know these people so well, I know that bloke could do a good job. Well, of course you do, but for the purposes of the procurement process, and also for the purposes of good decision and good use of resources, you've got to test that. That's what procurement processes are for. We also still see misuse of resources around construction materials and labour. If there's any building going on at the organisation, it's surprising how many people all of a sudden find that they have a new wing to their holiday home that's been funded by that same construction budget through the hospital. And also, very useful to read is the IBAC report that was published late last year around the particular corruption risks in health services. I'm going to share a slide at the end of this presentation with some great resources if you want to do some deeper reading around any of these topics. The IBAC report was a more general one as opposed to targeting one particular organisation or describing an investigation that they'd done, but mentioned two additional corruption risks in public health: the theft of controlled drugs, which is quite common apparently, and fraudulent billing practices. So all of these are things that we need to be across because, as I said, it's incredibly easy to make a complaint. Now, this is a snapshot of the IBAC website that I'm probably more familiar with than most of you in the room. All you need to do on the IBAC website is click Make a Complaint. It brings up the form, you type in your details and press Submit. Done. And as I said, if IBAC comes knocking, you should be nervous. They're very good. I'm not suggesting they're going to punish you, but you need to be able to demonstrate that decisions you made were not corrupt, were not inappropriately influenced by personal relationships, conflicts of interest, etc. A similar type of complaints mechanism exists for sexual harassment as well, of course, and discrimination, both in terms of the state, the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission. And as it should be, very easy to make a complaint. I think Kim mentioned earlier that the Me Too movement had really highlighted the importance of allowing and encouraging people who have concerns about inappropriate behaviour to come forward and to ensure that they feel safe to do so. Yeah, and I'm going to come back to that further. I've mentioned a couple of specific risks for bullying, sexual harassment and corrupt conduct. There are two key risks that boards should be aware of that will heighten the likelihood of some of these bad behaviours occurring in the first place and becoming entrenched over time. And they are these. Firstly, employees don't feel they can speak up. And secondly, boards don't ask the right questions. One of the simplest things you could do as board directors going away today would be to think, if I were an employee being sexually harassed in the hospital that I govern today, how would I make a complaint? Right? So just think, how easy is it to find the policy? How easy is it to understand who I would contact to raise a concern? If I read the policy as an employee, is there anything in there that tells me about what happens if I get victimised? Is there anything that says we will not allow you, we can't allow, we will not tolerate you being treated less favourably for having raised a concern? What would the employee do if the person who's sexually harassing them or bullying them is their supervisor, their supervisor's supervisor, or in fact, dare I say, the CEO? Because if it's easy for the employee to understand how they do that, they're far more likely to use an internal avenue. And that's what you want. You want employees to feel safe, and you want them to feel that they can easily and safely raise a concern internally about something that's happening to them. It's for a couple of reasons. One, that it's the right thing to do. It will help develop a healthy and safe culture across the board. It's the right thing to do by that individual employee, and it will also far lessen the risk for the organisation that a bullying or sexualised culture will develop over time. Because if you can catch the sexual harasser early and either discipline them, re-educate them or remove them from the workplace, then that sexualised culture won't develop. Now, I'm going to talk now about some of these poor behaviours that I've just described, but from a governance perspective. And I've chosen 5 elements of governance. I know that, I made this up, so the AICD may have some others, and, this isn't intended to be completely comprehensive, but, from my practice on boards and discussions with boards about building healthy and ethical workplace cultures, these are 5 things that we really need to give good thought to. Performance, risk, the values of the organisation, compliance, which is kind of the obvious one, and culture. So I'm going to talk through each of these 5 elements from a governance perspective. I think one of the tricky things to do when we're thinking about poor behaviour in the workplace is it is very operational, right? So, you know, we can read a lot from, you know, WorkSafe or, you know, or IBAC or other regulators about how these behaviours are illegal and that they shouldn't be allowed in any Australian workplace. Absolutely agree. And yet the management of people and how they treat each other on the ground can seem very far removed from the boardroom. So one of the things that's a challenge, I think, when thinking about managing these risks is keeping that governance hat on and not getting dragged too much into operations, but feeling confident that this poor workplace behaviours is a risk that we should be managing and can manage like any other risk in the workplace or in the organisation. So firstly, let's talk about performance. There was some great research done by the University of New South Wales, University of Macquarie and a number of other business schools around the world in 2011, which did some deep dives into the workplace culture of 78 different organisations and companies, most of whom were in Australia, and identified the real high performers from a traditional performance sense. So these high-performing workplaces were 12% more productive, 20% more innovative. They had a higher profit margin or return on assets if they were non-profit, and their customers were 24.8% more satisfied. They also had lower rates of unplanned staff turnover. They had better attendance rates by staff, lower workers' compensation claims and costs, and lower levels of conflict and tension. How beautiful. Now that's the sort of workplace that we would like to see, right? Excuse me, those winter lurgies. In those workplaces, there was an incredibly high correlation with how ethical the culture was, how engaged the managers were, and how skilled the managers were at working with staff to resolve problems. So, for example, in the workplaces that were in the high-performing workplaces group that had very high performance in other senses, managers and supervisors and leaders spent more time and effort managing people, 29% more. They were 19% more likely to give recognition and reward to staff and celebrate successes, 21% more likely to encourage feedback and learning, etc., fostering involvement and cooperation, having difficult conversations with skill, etc. So there's a lot to be said for ensuring that the mid-level managers have the skill to have good conversations with staff, to identify the signs of poor culture and poor behaviour early on, and to intervene. So if we're aware that if we want a high-performing workplace, some of the questions, of course, we can ask in the workplace culture sense is, how could we improve our performance by working on the workplace culture? So are there signs that you're getting at board level that perhaps the culture might be a bit off? You know, what might that be doing to our performance at a higher level in terms of accreditation, in terms of client satisfaction, etc.? From a risk perspective, poor workplace behaviours increase other risks. Now, Commissioner Grimes touched on this a little earlier, but there's quite a bit of international research to show that clinical risk and other risks to patients are elevated where there's bullying, sexual harassment and other poor behaviour by staff to other staff. Now, that's not really surprising. You know, for those of us who've worked in a toxic culture, we know that some of the impacts are loss of motivation, less commitment to the employer, less discretionary effort, you know, that 10% extra that we're all trying to win of our staff, and lower levels of concentration on the job and a greater risk of making mistakes. Now, from a common sense perspective, that really does make sense, right? If you've got someone who is fearful, who is being harassed or bullied, either physically or psychologically, you know, they're not working to their best. You know, they're working in a state of fear. They're less likely to put their hand up and say, we should be doing something differently and better. Can I offer a new idea? And they're also less likely to raise concerns when they see an occupational health and safety risk that is a physical risk, something that's different to the psychological with bullying, etc. There have also been studies to show that bullying and sexual harassment impacts on patient safety, including underreporting of safety and quality concerns and increases in harm, errors, infections and other added costs. So this isn't just nice to have, right? This is not just about, we need to have a good workplace to be able to compete for the best candidates. This comes down to the absolute heart of what we do. From a legal risk perspective, of course, there's vicarious liability that the organisation has for the actions of individual staff, and also then increased risk of Fair Work Australia claims, occupational health and safety, etc. Operational risks that can be increased by bullying, sexual harassment and other inappropriate behaviours include stress leave, turnover, loss of management time in managing complaints and conflict, and of course reputational risk. I think that's really been highlighted not only by the Me Too movement but also by the Royal Commissions. We've seen that, and public reports where hospitals have had some significant issues around patient safety. Our stakeholders, the whole community expect us to ensure that our staff are safe at work and that they're not going to be harassed and that we are taking into account these risks as governors of the organisation. Any questions so far? Very quiet. It's also serious. Values. Now, I won't ask you to tell me what the values are of your organisation. Some organisations have them loud and proud and put them on lanyards and, squeezy balls and posters on the wall and things, and others are not so loud about it. It doesn't mean they have less values. It just means that they don't have quite such a PR approach, I suppose you could say. But it is important to understand what the values are of our organisation, as well as the values of the Public Sector Commission, as Paul mentioned. And then to think, well, are these values just a PR exercise on the wall in a poster? Or are we really living and breathing those values every day? Do they really inform our decisions about how we go about our work? Are they just aspirational? Are they a nice idea? Or do we really know what something like respect actually means? Right? Have you done any workshops, perhaps either at board level or perhaps the senior executive team have done, about what integrity means? Integrity means that we're generally good, that we do what we say we're going to do, or does integrity mean that our values set works well together? They're integrated. When I was talking about values at Monash University a few years ago, and someone in the back row said it's none of those things, it means the bridge doesn't fall down, because she was a structural engineer. But when you think about it, integrity and the bridge not falling down is actually quite a good analogy, because the bridge, if it has integrity, will withstand semi-trailers, tons and tons, zooming over the top of them repeatedly with not a little crack or a little sprinkling of mortar coming out from the bricks. As should our values be. And yet, if you talk to a board and say, what does integrity mean, my examples showed, you might get 4 different definitions. So thinking about values, not only in terms of the theory of the values, but what does that actually mean? And ensuring that the staff understand that. Values mean we won't shout at each other, even when we're under incredible pressure. Now that sounds obvious to us, at board level, but it's not out there in the real world. It's also important to think about how we as board members are walking the talk. Because I tell you now, culture and the ethical culture of an organisation is set from the top. One of the webinars that we do at WorkLogic is called Toxic at the Top. We're now doing it every year by popular demand, and we get more than 400 people dialing in to listen to it every time. So people are very concerned about having someone in a senior position, including on the board, who thinks that they can occupy that position without fear or favour. And I've got something, this is an important issue and I'm entitled to test it and to express it as fully and firmly as I want it. Well, no, you don't actually. Not if you're going to be swearing, thumping the table, shouting. And it does happen very, very commonly. So we need to think as directors, if these are the values of the organisation, and if these are the values that the Public Sector Commission and the Public Administration Act require us to apply in everything we do as board directors, how do we hold ourselves accountable as individuals and as a board? Are we able to have those conversations? Are we able to check each other and call each other out and say, look, that behaviour is not okay. You know, that's not constructive. You know, often the power at boards can be tricky. Often there's people on boards who've been there for a very long time, and it can be hard to speak truth to power. I'm not sure who said that first, but it's a great phrase. But we need to make sure that we are the best examples of the values of the organisation, not the exceptions. The compliance side, as I said, is probably one of the more obvious because there are so many laws and regulations in this space that cover all of the behaviours that we've been discussing today, and also that cover our duties as directors. So here's a list of just a few. As I said, there are very, very many. One of the things that can be a bit overwhelming, I think, as a director is how to keep up, because it does feel like that there's a lot of change, new expectations, new regulations, new risks coming to light, and sometimes I think we can feel like we're never quite able to stay on top of it. One of the things I know I enjoy on the boards that I'm on is a great sense of camaraderie and sharing of information, and our CEO does that too. It's at Queen Elizabeth Centre, in terms of sending us copies of reports out of interest. You know, there's a lot of really good data and good case studies that are available publicly that can inform our discussions at board level. The other thing that I think is really important is for us to ask, are we getting the right reports at board level to be confident that we're compliant with the expectations on this organisation and the laws, in fact, about what sort of workplace we must ensure for our staff. It's our job to ensure that our staff can come to work without fear of being sexually harassed or bullied. And it's our job to ensure that the assets and resources that are available to the organisation are used properly and are not chipped away or wasted or misused with conflict of interest or other shady deals. Culture is an interesting thing. I think a lot of people have this idea that, oh yes, we know culture matters because Peter Drucker told us long time ago that culture eats strategy for breakfast. But what is culture? Like how do you get a sense of it? It's quite hard. It's a bit like the vibe you're on, you know. I mean, some of the elements of culture that have been identified that are useful to think through, I think, are the vision of the organisation, the values that it says it aspires to, and the values that it actually lives every day, the ethics, the norms, the rituals, like what's the glue that holds us together? We're not just individual people who have a job or who are appointed by the minister to help lead this organisation. There is a culture and a sense of how we do the work. The observable patterns of behaviour, so the people make up the culture, and also the narrative. So what's the story of how we describe what we do and how we go about it? I was talking to a CEO of a private company a couple of weeks ago because he wanted to talk about shifting the culture to a more innovative culture. And I said, well, tell me what the culture feels like now. And he said, oh, it's great. You know, we all sing from the same hymn book. We've been around for 57 years and most of our staff are nearing retirement because they've been around for so long. I said, well, you know, that's terrific. And are they open to innovation? Oh, well, we play as one team here. Now, if you play as one team, you know, the undercurrent of that is no one can say anything that might challenge the way we're already doing things at the moment. So how are you going to build a culture of innovation with that? You know, it's an interesting challenge. I should say I'm not in any way suggesting that people who are approaching retirement are less innovative, because they're certainly not. It was the way he was talking about the culture being the same and the consistency of that culture being a huge asset. The other thing that's relevant when we think about culture is place, right? What does it look like when you walk in? What are some of the messages? You know, is the patient waiting area much nicer than the staff tea room behind the scenes? Little things like that. You know, are there cracks appearing? I mean, you know, we all work with limited resources, so I'm not suggesting every workplace has to be perfect. But if you look around the workplaces that your staff are in, what does that tell you about their experience of the culture? And one of the significant risks for sexual harassment and bullying too is remote work and work when no one else is watching. because a lot of people are very artful and manipulative, I'm sad to say, about when they choose to sexually harass others. And it's when there's no security cameras, often in private homes if you have people doing home visits, or in night shift when there's fewer people around. So have a think about the culture of your workplace as well as the spaces they're working in, and whether that might be increasing or decreasing the risk that people are treated badly. So some of the questions again that we can ask at board level, do we have the workplace culture that we need to achieve our strategy? How can the board support the CEO to close the gap, if there is one? So if there's a gap between the current state and the desired state of culture, what are we going to do about that? You know, it's not neat because it's not as easy as an engineering solution to a problem, but that doesn't mean that we're any less responsible to achieve it. Just looking at the timing, I think we're doing beautifully. So, signs and symptoms. How does bad behaviour become apparent? So this question is about if there is something going wrong in your organisation, what are some of the ways that you at board level might notice that? What are some of the things you can look for or ask for if that data is not being freely provided to you? So one of them, of course, the People Matters survey results. I quite often get people calling me up and saying, oh, we knew we had a problem in this unit, and then we saw the People Matters survey results and we couldn't pretend it wasn't there anymore. So there's a great deal of accountability and visibility that that survey provides. Can be sometimes, I think, the kick in the pants that people need to actually take action. I know that's not its intention, Paul, but it's a lovely one. Also, the content of complaints from patients and staff. Now, the reason that I've written content of complaints, not number of complaints, is, of course, as I'm sure of you can see, you're nodding, you know this, if you're getting no complaints, it doesn't mean that you don't have any problems, it just means you have no complaints. Right? So if you're not getting any complaints, you might instead think, why aren't we getting any complaints? Or what feedback are we getting? What are the mechanisms? You know, how often do people fill out the feedback form or the little iPad that you've got at the reception, etc.? Also having a look at turnover. Is there a particularly high level of turnover in a particular team? And is there a reason for that? You know, there may be a particularly, a completely innocuous reason, or it may in fact indicate that there might be something going wrong with a manager or another member of that team that's driving people away. And then there's some of those more obvious HR metrics like work cover complaints and stress claims. And I highly recommend exit interviews with executives. So I was asked recently to do an exit interview of the head of a particular clinical area as she was leaving. I should be very clear, not at the boards I'm on. And I asked this person, so I go in very naively, oh, tell me why you're leaving, because she was going off to a great job. And she said, well, because the HR director is a toxic psychopath. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And she explained it was a dreadful situation where a number of people who report to the HR director had left. Some poor performers or people who, for personal reasons, weren't able to find another job were stuck there. And even more scarily, the view of the rest of the executive team was that the CEO was captured by this HR director because she was suffering some of her own personal issues and was really struggling to make decisions. So instead, a lot of the decisions were being made by the HR director and the rest were being made by very expensive consultants. So I took that back to the board and they were quite gobsmacked. Now, just because a senior executive tells you those things, it doesn't mean necessarily that that's a fair and balanced view. This person may be leaving for a lot of different reasons, but at the same time, it's very rich data. And also, another sign that something might be wrong, as a lag indicator that you've got a problem, is if directors are asking questions of the CEO or other executives who are presenting and they're not quite getting a full answer, right? Do be a critical friend. I think cynicism is very healthy sometimes. At another board that I was supporting, the HR director had explained away People Matters survey results, explained away, and had been quite diverting almost Trump style, in doing some little pulse surveys, inverted commas, on issues that she knew the results. I'm sounding very anti-HR. It's a coincidence with those two examples. So she picked pulse surveys, which were quite specific, little things that she did about quarterly with 5 questions on topics that she knew would get really great results. Right, and said, oh, well, I know that, it does appear that we have a bit of an issue over here with sexual harassment, but look how great we are on this thing, that thing, work-life balance. And others are like, well, that's great. Doesn't mean we don't have a problem over here with sexual harassment. Diversion. Yeah. So if there are questions that you're being, what had happened there, is one of the directors kept saying, why aren't we asking the same questions again? Why don't we do a deep dive on the people matter issue that that we know we've got a problem with? That's all very nice, the work-life balance stuff, but what about sexual harassment? And the question just didn't get up. There was always a reason why. Oh no, that's okay. Paper over problems, And sometimes I think it's hard, particularly when we have a very cohesive board, to be the squeaky wheel, and to be saying that's not okay. I'm not satisfied. And there's lots of different ways that we work in terms of influencing, working with the chair behind the scenes, talking with other directors, etc. But make sure your questions get answered. And lead indicators. Let's have some lightness and something positive for the morning. All this grim workplace behaviour. So what are the good signs? Good signs that things are going well. Right, because of course, we should ask for these indicators and data too. So some of the things that we see really good organisations do to ensure that any possibility of a sexualised, bullying, aggressive or corrupt culture is developing, that they jump on that really early, and that there are great avenues for individuals to raise concerns if they have them, internally ideally, so we can address them before some of the regulators get involved, which is also a very effective way to address issues. One is that, for example, on discrimination and sexual harassment, do we do checks on unconscious bias when we make decisions at senior levels? Are our policies up to date, and do they protect the rights of the employees? Because often you have a look at a policy and there's something vague in there about harassment, but we're too polite to say sexual harassment, and the policy's too old to have a proper definition of bullying in it. So, an employee who's being bullied or sexually harassed reads this and it's vague and it's not clear even that harassment, as explained, is banned. So have a look at the policies that you have that cover these areas. And again, as I said, think of it through the lens of, I'm an individual who's being bullied. How would I raise a complaint internally? Some other good signs are that staff know what the values mean. Perhaps they've done workshops of above the line and below the line behaviours, or what a great workplace looks like to me and what I'm going to do tomorrow to push the workplace in that direction. And another thing I think that we can help model at board level is being able to discuss ethical issues with respect. Because there really should be no unspeakable issues, right? A culture of silence, as I mentioned earlier, is a major risk factor for poor behaviour, not just occurring, but being allowed to continue to occur. Whereas if we can say to each other, there must be a better way, or what's the best way? What would our stakeholders expect, from a values perspective, etc. This will make it less likely that these major risks will continue. Another thing, of course, is clear reporting channels, and I mentioned earlier to try putting yourself in the complainant's shoes and have a look at the policies. Some organisations have also set up some sort of whistleblower line or helpline. As Kim mentioned earlier, there's also the independent facilitators that are going to be introduced by Safer Care Victoria early in the new year, which is another channel, not of making complaints, but of information and understanding the avenues of complaints that employees will be able to take advantage of. So that role already exists in the Department of Health and Human Services, and anecdotally and also on the statistics we see that he's doing fantastic work. Question in the back.
Andrew Levings, Portland District Health. My question is, will these independent facilitators from Safer Care Victoria be available to help with exit interviews?
I don't believe so, although I know that the full position description of the independent facilitators is still being developed by Safer Care Victoria. They're primarily there to be an, if you like, off-the-record source of reality checking, avenues, information, and listening for employees who are being harassed. So I don't believe that they will be doing exit interviews, but as I said, Safer Care Victoria, as I understand it, is still developing the role. Also, it's important to note that the right people are in the leadership positions. You know, having people who are themselves ethical, who understand the public sector values and the values of the organisation, who are proactive in addressing risks and problems when they arise, and who treat each other with respect. Also, who treat the CEO with respect. Yeah, and as I said earlier, it's no excuse to say, oh, well, you know, I've been appointed here to be the big stick. No, you haven't. You've been appointed to hold the CEO and accountable for the achievement of the strategic and operational goals of the organisation, but that doesn't mean you have to beat them up. Even if things aren't going well, there are always constructive and respectful ways of improving performance. So in terms of further resources, as I said, we're sometimes bombarded by information, but there's some very useful resources that you can seek out for yourselves, thanks to the wonderful internet. DHHS has created a directors toolkit specifically for health board directors, and it's excellent. So all you need to do is Google DHHS directors toolkit health, and up it will pop. It's quite recent. It was only released at the end of last year, and it's a very good read, so I recommend it. Also, if you wanted to learn more about what bullying looks like and what my duties are, you know, as an officer in terms of occupational health and safety law, etc., WorkSafe Victoria's website is excellent, so is the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission's. IBAC's useful, always a fascinating read. IBAC publishes its reports about the big investigations that it's done, and also some guidance around, as I mentioned earlier, some of the risks, for example, in corruption in health services. So they're quite specific and they're very practical. So they're really good if you either want to educate yourself a bit more or you think there might be a risk of this nature in your organisation, please do have a look at those. And also, as I said, the Victorian Public Sector Commission, the AICD, and the Ethics Centre in Sydney is also an interesting source of articles about certain things. So fundamentally, I hope the takeaways from this presentation have been to encourage you that you can, as directors, lead a safe and ethical workplace and ensure that these risks are managed from the governance perspective without getting too operational. And some of the things that you can keep in mind are, you know, knowing the statistics that we've heard this morning, knowing the risks, and knowing the sort of leader that I am and that I want to be. What steps do I need to take in this organisation to fulfil my responsibilities? And another test, which is perhaps a little bit more negative, is, for example, if my actions were reviewed by the Victorian Auditor General's Office, would I still be proud and confident? If a staff member in the hospital that I govern committed suicide in circumstances in which they were bullied, is there anything that I would have liked to have done differently? And when you next receive your board papers, I'd encourage you, I mean, I know you always look at them critically, but have a think about those board papers through this lens. So lead indicators, lag indicators, look at them critically and think, do these reports really show me what I need to know to be confident that I'm meeting my duties to create a safe and ethical workplace with a respectful culture? So there's some questions I'll leave with you. Before we break for lunch, I'll just describe what we're going to do after lunch. On your table, there are 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, 2 and 3. These may seem outlandish to some of you, but they're all based on real cases. What we're going to do after lunch is discuss at the table this scenario, and then I'm going to ask for some key learnings and ideas that you've had at your table to be shared, and we'll put them up on a slide so you can see them all. A couple of things to note. Firstly, even though the substantive sessions today are being filmed and that will be released as a webinar, we won't be filming the scenario discussions or the feedback at the end of the scenario discussions, just to encourage people to speak very freely, because we may be, of course, sharing situations and experiences that we have, hopefully not from our own current boards, but maybe other organisations we're involved with. So we want the conversation to be very free. And I'll just let you know that at the end of the discussion of the scenarios, what I'll be asking you to focus on in terms of the feedback that we share with everyone is, what would I do as a board director if this case came to my attention? So there are a number of more meaty and specific questions for each of the scenarios, but as I said, the question I'll be asking, what would I do as a board director if this issue came to my attention? Now, we've got 3 scenarios in case some of you like to think ahead, not that we're expecting you to work through lunch. I'll suggest that the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tables in that corner do scenario 1. That includes table 6 and 8. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, these here, including that table, I can't see the number, 7. So including table 7, do scenario 2. And these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tables do scenario 3. So thank you very much. We'll be coming back. We'll be back at 12:45 after lunch. Thanks, everyone.